From illiterate teenage killer to Wall Street genius, all from behind bars. Curtis Carroll's transformation will challenge everything you think you know about second chances and human potential. This is the most inspiring prison story ever told. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible transformation stories. Curtis Carroll, now 53 years old. Sentenced to 54 years to life for murder at age 17. Couldn't read or write when he entered prison. Today, he's known as the Oracle of San Quentin, America's most unlikely financial genius. Mrs. Patterson, volunteer prison librarian. 15 years of experience teaching inmates basic literacy. She was the first person to believe in Curtis's potential and taught him how to read at age 20. Robert Chen, 45 years old, convenience store clerk working a second job to support his family. His tragic death during Curtis's robbery changed both their lives forever. Dr. Maria Santos, criminologist and prison reform advocate. She studied Curtis's transformation and helped document the success of his financial literacy program. Some people are born surrounded by opportunities. Curtis Carroll was born into a world where even the word opportunity didn't exist. From illiterate teenage killer to prison's Wall Street genius. This is the most incredible transformation story you'll ever hear. Oakland, California, 1971. The streets echoed with the sounds of poverty, violence, and desperation. In a cramped apartment in one of the city's most dangerous neighborhoods, Curtis Carroll entered a world that seemed designed to break him before he could even begin to fight back. His mother, barely 18 herself, struggled to keep food on the table while his father remained a ghost, present in DNA but absent in every way that mattered. Curtis's earliest memories weren't of bedtime stories or family dinners. They were of hunger, of adults arguing in hushed, angry whispers, of sirens wailing through the night like urban lullabies. By the time he was 6 years old, Curtis had learned that the world was divided into two types of people: those who took what they needed and those who went without. School should have been his escape, but it became another prison. Curtis couldn't focus on letters and numbers when his stomach was empty and his clothes were the same ones he'd worn for weeks. Teachers saw him as just another problem kid from the wrong side of town. They didn't see the bright, observant child beneath the anger and defiance. They didn't see someone worth saving. By age 8, Curtis was already supplementing his family's income in ways no child should ever have to consider. He started small, stealing candy from corner stores, lifting loose change from unlocked cars. The rush of successfully taking something without getting caught became addictive. More importantly, the few dollars he brought home made his mother smile, and in Curtis's young mind that made everything worth it. I wasn't born bad, Curtis would later reflect. I was born into circumstances that made being bad seem like the only logical choice. The streets of Oakland in the 1980s were unforgiving to children like Curtis. The crack epidemic was tearing through urban communities like wildfire, leaving destroyed families and desperate people in its wake. Gang violence was commonplace. Police were seen as occupying forces rather than protectors. In this environment, criminal activity wasn't seen as deviance, it was seen as survival. By age 12, Curtis had dropped out of school entirely, not officially. He simply stopped showing up and no one seemed to notice or care. He spent his days learning a different curriculum: how to case a house, how to pick locks, how to run fast enough to outpace pursuing security guards. He was getting an education, just not the kind anyone would put on a resume. Curtis's crimes escalated as he grew older and bolder. Petty theft became burglary. Burglary became armed robbery. Each successful crime built his confidence and his reputation on the streets. He was making more money as a teenager than most adults in his neighborhood made working legitimate jobs. To Curtis, this seemed like proof that he had found his calling. But Curtis was illiterate. At 17 years old, he could barely write his own name and couldn't read beyond an elementary level. This didn't matter in his world. Street smarts were more valuable than book smarts, and Curtis had plenty of the former. He could calculate drug profits in his head, but he couldn't read a newspaper. He could plan complex heists, but he couldn't fill out a job application. The irony was devastating. Curtis was highly intelligent, with a natural ability for mathematical concepts and strategic thinking. But he had never been in an environment that recognized or cultivated these gifts. Instead, his intelligence was channeled into criminal enterprises that would ultimately destroy his future. The night that changed everything happened on March 15, 1989. Curtis, now 17, was planning what he thought would be his biggest score yet, robbing a convenience store that was known to keep large amounts of cash on hand. He had studied the location for weeks, learning the staff's routines and the store's security weaknesses. In his mind, this was going to be a clean, simple job. But nothing about that night went according to plan. Curtis entered the store at 11:47 p.m. wearing a ski mask and carrying a .38 caliber revolver he had borrowed from an older associate. The plan was simple: demand the money, get out fast, no violence necessary. The store clerk, a middle-aged man named Robert Chen who was working a second job to support his family, was supposed to simply hand over the cash and let Curtis disappear into the night. Instead, Robert Chen made a decision that cost him his life and destroyed Curtis's future. Whether out of bravery, foolishness, or simply panic, Robert reached for something behind the counter. Curtis, high on adrenaline and fear, assumed it was a weapon. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the small store. Robert Chen collapsed behind the counter, blood spreading across the linoleum floor. Curtis stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, staring at what he had done. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was a thief, not a killer. Curtis grabbed the money from the register, less than $200, and ran. But he had left behind fingerprints, witnesses, and security camera footage. Within 48 hours, Oakland police had identified him. Within a week, he was arrested at his mother's apartment. The trial was swift and merciless. Curtis's public defender was overworked and underpaid, handling dozens of similar cases simultaneously. Curtis himself was barely able to read the charges against him, let alone understand the complex legal proceedings that would determine his fate. When asked to read documents aloud in court, Curtis had to admit his illiteracy, adding another layer of humiliation to an already devastating situation. The prosecutor painted Curtis as a cold-blooded killer, a young man who had chosen violence and showed no remorse for destroying an innocent family. Curtis wanted to explain that it had been an accident, that he never intended to hurt anyone, but he lacked the vocabulary and communication skills to articulate his thoughts effectively. On November 3, 1989, Curtis Carroll was sentenced to 54 years to life in prison for first-degree murder during the commission of a robbery. At 17 years old, he was essentially receiving a death sentence. He would likely die behind bars, having spent his entire adult life in a cage. Curtis entered San Quentin State Prison in December 1989 as Inmate C. 58030. He was scared, angry, and completely unprepared for the realities of life in one of America's most notorious correctional facilities. San Quentin housed over 4,000 inmates, including many of California's most violent criminals. Death row was located in the same complex, adding an extra layer of grimness to an already oppressive environment. The first few years were brutal. Curtis had to learn quickly how to survive in a world where weakness was punished and violence was currency. He joined a gang for protection, got into fights, spent months in solitary confinement for various infractions. He was becoming exactly what the system expected him to become: a hardened criminal with no hope of redemption. But in 1994, something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of Curtis's life forever. Curtis was sitting in the prison library, not because he was reading, but because it was one of the quieter places to avoid trouble, when another inmate left behind a discarded newspaper. Curtis picked it up, intending to use it as scratch paper, when something caught his eye: the financial section. Curtis couldn't read most of the words, but he could see numbers, charts, and graphs. More importantly, he could see patterns. The stock prices rose and fell in ways that reminded him of the mathematical calculations he used to do in his head when planning crimes or calculating drug profits. For the first time since entering prison, Curtis felt intellectually curious about something legitimate. "I saw those numbers going up and down," Curtis later recalled, "and I realized this was just another system to figure out. And if there was one thing I was good at, it was figuring out systems." Curtis approached a prison librarian and asked a question that would change his life: "Can you teach me to read?" The librarian, an elderly volunteer named Mrs. Patterson, who had been working with inmates for over a decade, saw something in Curtis that others had missed. Despite his imposing physical presence and intimidating prison tattoos, she recognized intelligence and genuine desire to learn. "Why do you want to learn now?" she asked him. Curtis pointed to the financial section of the newspaper. "I want to understand this. I want to understand money." Mrs. Patterson began meeting with Curtis twice a week, starting with basic phonics and gradually working up to more complex reading comprehension. It was humbling work for a young man who had built his identity around being street smart and tough. Curtis struggled with elementary-level concepts that most people master in childhood. But Curtis was motivated by something more powerful than pride. He was motivated by the possibility of becoming someone different than who he had been. For the first time in his life, he had a goal that didn't involve taking something from someone else. The progress was slow but steady. After 6 months, Curtis could read simple sentences. After a year, he was working through basic books. After 2 years, he was reading financial newspapers and magazines, building his vocabulary one word at a time. As his reading improved, Curtis became obsessed with understanding the stock market and personal finance. He read everything he could get his hands on: annual reports, investment guides, business magazines. He checked out economics textbooks from the prison library and worked through complex mathematical concepts that he had never encountered in his limited formal education. What Curtis discovered was that he had a natural aptitude for financial analysis. The same pattern recognition skills that had made him an effective criminal also made him capable of understanding market trends and investment strategies. The mathematical abilities that he had used for calculating drug profits could be applied to calculating compound interest and portfolio diversification. More importantly, Curtis began to understand something fundamental about money that had eluded him his entire life: the difference between making money and building wealth. "On the streets, I was always thinking about the next score," Curtis explained years later. "In prison, I learned to think about the next generation." By 1997, Curtis had become the prison's unofficial financial advisor. Inmates would come to him with questions about their family's finances, their children's college funds, their retirement planning. Curtis, who had never legally earned more than minimum wage, was teaching other people how to build legitimate wealth. Curtis started a financial literacy program called Financial Empowerment Emotional Literacy, FEEL. The program taught basic financial concepts to inmates who, like Curtis, had grown up in environments where legitimate wealth building was never discussed or modeled. The program's core philosophy was revolutionary in the context of prison education. Instead of focusing on job skills or anger management, Curtis focused on changing how inmates thought about money and their economic futures. He taught them about compound interest, diversification, and long-term planning. Most importantly, he taught them that building wealth was possible even for people with criminal backgrounds. Most of us grew up thinking money was something you took, Curtis told his students. I'm here to teach you that money is something you build. The success of Curtis's program caught the attention of prison administrators and outside educators. In 2003, the University of California, Berkeley sent professors to evaluate Curtis's curriculum and teaching methods. They were shocked to discover that an illiterate former gang member had developed a financial education program that was more comprehensive and effective than many college-level courses. Curtis's reputation began to spread beyond San Quentin's walls. Financial journalists wrote articles about the unlikely Wall Street expert who was teaching investment strategies from death row. Business schools invited Curtis to guest lecture via video conference. Inmates at other facilities requested transfers specifically to participate in Curtis's program. But Curtis's most significant breakthrough came in 2010 when he was invited to speak at a TED conference via video link. The talk, titled How I Learned to Read and Trade Stocks in Prison, became one of the most viewed prison-related TED Talks in history. Standing in front of the camera in his orange prison jumpsuit, Curtis spoke directly to an audience of entrepreneurs, educators, and thought leaders about the transformative power of financial literacy. I may be in prison, Curtis said, but my mind is free, and a free mind can build wealth in any environment. The TED Talk brought Curtis national attention and validated his belief that financial education could be a powerful tool for rehabilitation. Requests for interviews poured in from major media outlets. Publishers offered book deals. Foundations wanted to fund expanded versions of his program. More importantly, Curtis's story began to change conversations about criminal justice reform and rehabilitation. Here was proof that even people who had committed serious crimes could transform themselves given the right tools and opportunities. Curtis's personal transformation was evident to everyone who knew him. The angry, illiterate teenager who had entered San Quentin in 1989 had become an articulate advocate for education and personal responsibility. He had taught himself not just to read and write, but to think critically about complex economic and social issues. Curtis represents the best of what prison education can accomplish, said Dr. Maria Santos, a criminologist who studied his case. He didn't just learn new skills, he fundamentally changed his identity and his relationship to society. By 2015, Curtis's financial literacy program had been implemented in over a dozen California prisons. Thousands of inmates had completed his curriculum, and recidivism rates among program graduates were significantly lower than the general prison population. Curtis also began working with at-risk youth in Oakland through video conferences, trying to prevent other young people from making the same mistakes he had made. His message was simple but powerful. Education and legitimate opportunity were always available, even in the most challenging circumstances. "I can't change what I did," Curtis told a group of teenagers during one video session. "But I can help you avoid making the same choices that brought me here." Curtis's work attracted the attention of major financial institutions and educational organizations. Goldman Sachs funded expanded versions of his program. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative provided grants for research into replicating his methods in other correctional facilities. In 2018, Curtis was granted his first parole hearing after serving 29 years in prison. The hearing was attended by supporters including business leaders, educators, and formerly incarcerated individuals whose lives had been changed by his programs. Curtis spoke eloquently about his transformation and his plans for the future. He outlined detailed proposals for expanding financial literacy education in underserved communities. He discussed his vision for creating pathways to legitimate economic opportunity for people with criminal backgrounds. The parole board was impressed by Curtis's rehabilitation and his contributions to society, but they ultimately denied his release, citing the severity of his original crime and the need for him to serve more time before being eligible for parole. Curtis was disappointed but not defeated. He returned to his cell and continued his work, expanding his curriculum and reaching even more people through digital platforms and partnerships with universities. "Freedom isn't just about being outside these walls," Curtis reflected after the hearing. "Freedom is about having the knowledge and skills to build the life you want, regardless of your circumstances." As of 2025, Curtis Carroll remains incarcerated at San Quentin, but his influence extends far beyond prison walls. His financial literacy program has been implemented in correctional facilities across the United States. His TED Talk has been viewed millions of times. His story has inspired books, documentaries, and academic research. Curtis has become living proof that transformation is possible at any stage of life, under any circumstances. He has shown that intelligence and potential exist in the most unlikely places and that education can literally save lives. "I entered prison as a problem for society," Curtis says. "I hope to leave as a solution." Curtis's next parole hearing is scheduled for 2026. Whether or not he is released, his legacy is already secure. He has transformed thousands of lives through his education programs and has fundamentally changed how people think about rehabilitation and second chances. The illiterate teenager who couldn't write his own name has become one of America's most influential voices on financial literacy and criminal justice reform. Curtis Carroll's story proves that it's never too late to change, never too late to learn, and never too late to become the person you were meant to be. From the streets of Oakland to the cells of San Quentin, Curtis Carroll has shown that the most powerful transformation happens not when circumstances change, but when people choose to change themselves. His journey from criminal to educator represents the very best of human potential and the transformative power of education. And in a prison cell in California, Curtis Carroll continues to prove every day that some opportunities don't come to you. You create them yourself.